Our exploration today of lo popular as locus theologicus focuses on sport. Chicago is a sport-obsessed city. As opening day of the Major League Baseball season approaches, our north side, south side rivalries emerge from hibernation. Chicago baseball is imbued with tales of scandal, curses, and even hope. Racism, gambling, cheating, performance-enhancing drugs, and xenophobia share the landscape with the elusive championship dreams of long-suffering Cubs fans and with Sox fans' expectations of a World Series repeat in less than a century. In 1911, Chicago's own Albert Goodwill Spaulding established baseball as America's national game. Spaulding brought missionary zeal to spreading the sport globally in service as well to his business interests as a purveyor of sporting goods. The transformation of baseball into a professional sport and capital venture with ongoing labor problems and imperial impulse bears Spaulding's imprint. His survey of baseball's antecedents noted, quote, "The ecclesiastics of the early church adopted this symbol, ball tossing, and gave it a very special significance by meeting in the churches on Easter Day and throwing up a ball from hand to typify the resurrection. Is it any coincidence then that the Chicago team Spaulding played with, led, and partly owned begins the 2015 MLB season on Easter Sunday, tossing the ball with the Cardinals, no less?" That one was for you, Cardinal Ravasi. Mi regalo a ti. Sport is among the rich and varied cultures of the daily. Therefore, it is a legitimate site for critical exploration by Latino theologians who privilege lo cotidiano as revelatory source. Sport rides the margins of theology with complicated global histories often situated in religious experiences, from the ancient Greeks to the ball-playing Aztecs. Mi nuevo amigo, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, shares our interest in the promise of sport. In June 2012, he instituted the Department of Culture and Sport. The objectives call for careful, interdisciplinary analysis and mutual dialogue with sport as an intercultural phenomenon. Reflecting embodiedness, the Council also sponsors the St. Peter's Cricket Club, adding a concrete and kinetic dimension to interreligious, ecumenical, and intercultural dialogue. This exercise today in Latino theology begins not in abstraction, but in the complexity of the lived experience of los primos, the cousins, cricket, and baseball. A hermeneutical privilege of the margins is employed, and critical attention given to the relationship between colonization and evangelization, since both of these sports were part of the imperial projects rooted in Christian theological assumptions about mission. Theologizing Latinamente on cricket y baseball and how they were and continue to be lived in resistance on the margins expands the purview of contemporary constructive theologies on sport. Such theologizing shares with Ravasi a hope that at its best, sport can be lived in convivencia, a just and negotiated living together accomplished in the spirit of the court of the Gentiles. My theologizing, like all theologizing Latinamente, is invested and socially located. My father taught me to love and to play baseball, and in nuestra familia, we were traditioned into Yankees universe, not to be confused with evil empire as the Red Sox nation, Goizueta, insists on calling us. You too, MT. I was traded to Chicago, as I understand my move to CTU. It coincided with the trade of then Yankees pitcher, Jose Contreras, also a Cuban, to the White Sox from the Yankees. My first homesick act was to attend his first pitched game in his new Southside Stadium. It was an act of solidarity among Hispanic urban migrant workers. Non-innocent evangelizations with Bible and bat. In the history of Christianity, sport and games, including the precursors of cricket and baseball, are found in the marginalia of medieval manuscripts. This presence indicates that play was a part of daily living, yet there is ambiguity about interpreting its role. Scholars connect some of these games to religious festivals and fairs. Such play participated in the carnival dimension of life that seemingly overturned power relations and the status quo, yet at the same time owed its very existence to the dominant social forces which used play to exercise control. Popular culture scholar Richard Grenouille cautions, however, that, quote, carnival traditions among the games and sports of the people were always potentially oppositional, especially when threatened with regulations from above, end quote. The subversive and religious aspects of popular sport are notable in the instructions from 1684 Synod of the Diocese of Santiago de Cuba, which included the province of Florida. Bishop Juan Garcia de Palacios decreed that converted indigenous people could no longer play their ball game. The statute specifically warned ecclesial and government officials that they would be held accountable by God for, quote, all the sins, superstitions, and abominations which shall result from said games, if by their consent or neglect they did not prevent them from occurring. Cricket and baseball were key elements in Christian evangelization and colonization by Britain and the United States of America in the 19th and 20th centuries. The bat accompanied the Bible, and muscular Christianity was part of an expansionist, civilizing colonization that saw Catholics in these exotic lands as virtual non-Christians. Muscular Christianity and the so-called New Athleticism were a response to asceticism in Christian traditions and in certain spiritual practices of the newly colonized peoples in Asia. While self-discipline was characteristic of both, deprivation of the body was now perceived as weakening or feminizing masculinity and Christianity. For British evangelists, cricket was a means of civilizing the colonized into the behavior of a proper gentleman in a decidedly English and Christian image. The cricket ground, with its regulated play, brought an illusion of fairness that was dispelled in the reality of daily empire life. Because, as Grenouille points out, members of prominent amateur sports clubs still avoided play with colonized others because they felt they would be, quote, contaminated if they played or competed against non-gentlemen, a category that included artisans and laborers, colored colonials, and Indians, end quote. In the late 19th century, the USA moved from a nation divided into an imperial power, and baseball was part of a new creation narrative where threads of commerce, foreign policy, and eschatological vision fueled expansion as a civilizing mission ordained by divine providence. Spaulding's claim that baseball followed the flag was no exaggeration. The baseball diamond brought the illusion of an egalitarianism grounded in meritocracy, governed by skill and fair play. Yet the field has never been level for the colonized other. And Major League Baseball continues to function as a colonial power with outposts across the globe. Through baseball, there was a traditioning, a civilizing into American individualism and the Protestant work ethic. Though color of skin, language, nation of origin, sometimes religion, and even ethnicity determine the quality of one's citizenship and access to the promised freedoms. The colonized other, however, exercised agency through resistance in ways that made these sports their own. Resistance in both cricket and baseball was manifest in the defeat of the allegedly superior white teams, especially military teams, in the cultivation of distinctive playing styles, in the exploitation of game rules, and in fielding teams and attracting fans from a spectrum of colonized others. The Cubans were the apostles of baseball, and the Dominicans are currently leading the reconquista of the USA national game by Latinos. Theologizing deportes in Spanglish. The theological question of the Imago Dei is at stake when sport is used as an evangelizing tool, and evangelization is understood in civilizing terms. The use of sport as part of a civilizing project displayed an inherent dismissal of God-given dignity reflected in the marginalized and colonized other. The goal was to recreate the other into a particular Christian image of either a British gentleman or a rugged American, yet without the power, the privilege, the access, and even the citizenship implicit in such an image. This non-innocent history continues to have impact today, and it cannot be ignored in the construction of contemporary theologies of sport. In resistance, dignity was protected through subversive agency. Guyanese theologian Winston Persaud has appropriated cricket as text, as interpreted in the lives of Caribbean people of color, in order to interpret the biblical story of Ruth. According to Persaud, in cricket, West Indians of color found a means of resistance, quote, by entering the master's domain of play and leisure and mastering it from within, giving the oppressed a vital reason for believing that they are not what they seem, marginalized, powerless, essentially inferior human beings. In focusing on the international success of Indo-Guyanese batsman Rahan Kanhai, Persaud finds connection with Ruth, two aliens who forge identities for themselves in a new land and for their respective peoples. By virtue of their accomplishments, both Ruth and Kanhai become greater than the confines of ethnic, cultural, religious, and class purity. Persaud appears to suggest that in these so-called aliens, one finds the seeds of convivencia. Sport, as part of evangelization and colonization, established perfection as a goal, an ideology whose impact on real bodies reflected racist, hypermasculine, classist, and ableist biases. These biases, along with socioeconomic disparity, abet the uneven playing field. In such circumstances, is it really such a surprise that subalterns attempt to level the playing field through age deception, strategic migration, performance enhancement technologies, and pharmaceuticals? What looks like cheating from the center might well be a survival strategy from the margins. Like the simians who play on the margins of manuscripts, parodying human behavior, calling attention to sinfulness, reminding readers of our shared created status and of our humanity, theologies of sport need to avoid abstraction and romanticization and embrace instead the complicated dailies out of which our theologies should arise. How does evangelization, which often helps to destroy cultures, contribute to mutual flourishing, to convivencia? How can sport, with its complicated legacies, commit to the construction of concord and social peace, and be a locus for convivencia, and even for hope? Latino theologies, as you heard earlier this morning, begin with a situated read of a particular and complex slices of lo cotidiano found on the margins. Like those medieval popular artists, we Latino theologians develop our alternate texts and interpretations, illuminate and comment on the texts at hand, and we resist on the edges of the page. We theologize in ways that intentionally disrupt, interrupt, and ensure that nuestras comunidades and the revelatory texts of las luchas y las fiestas are not erased, dismissed, ignored, civilized, exoticized, essentialized, or codified into neat but imposed categories. Mil gracias, Cardinal Ravasi, for engaging nuestras teologías en conjunto. Perhaps your attention to our Latinidad in the marginalia will ensure our visibility within our own church and in our theological academy. Amigo, if you are looking for another sports team to sponsor, consider el equipo de béisbol de San Pedro. You have met the starting nine, but our bench and our bullpen are deep from the presence of our Latino students who are here with us today and those from other marginalized and minoritized communities. And we continue to struggle en conjunto to raise up new generations of theologians from communities marginalized and minoritized in the United States context and in our higher educational institutions. Ever in hope, amigo, we proclaim, play ball. No gracias.
I told you that you were in for a very creative, very thoughtful day, and so far we are delivering on that promise. Maria Teresa Davila is Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics in the Andover Newton Theological School, and I am so happy to welcome you to Loyola University of Chicago, MT, in our ongoing effort to present una teología en conjunto.
I think it's appropriate since I think my placement sort of in the middle of all the presentations, I'm taking that as an opportunity to have us look a little bit about the context in which we try to do this Latino theology thing. And that is a context that is not necessarily receptive and a context that is downright hostile to a lot of the proposals that we bring to the table, the theological table. And so I will sort of twist the tables a little bit to speak about the challenge of a preferential option to faith in a context of privilege. So thank you, Miguel, for giving me this opportunity, and especially to my colegas for, again, engaging in powerful conversations together, which is always life-giving to me and my theology. The preferential option for what may be considered one of the central and most important insights in Christian theology in the 20th century, that decentering concept that embodies God's love becoming incarnate in our own suffering and poverty, falls flat on the ground on its arrival on U.S. shores. Let me suggest that in the context of privilege, the preferential option for the option for the poor, the option for history, the option for the more marginalized, the option for the young, the option for culture, goes head to head with the preferential option for the culture wars in the U.S. In its emphasis on the Church of the Poor, Vatican II laid out the foundation of what would become the preferential option for the poor as Latin American bishops and theologians returned from the council with the charge to be church in those places where the suffering of the people clamored for a witness of solidarity, spiritual poverty, and prophetic denunciation of the injustice and oppression, along with proclamation of liberation in history. In a way, the phrase, the preferential option for the poor, is both the culmination of an ongoing challenge from Vatican II. It encompasses the theological drive of a church that seeks to reach beyond itself, as Cardinal Ravasi told us last night, to proclaim integral liberation and mercy to the human family. And yet in the U.S. context, this remains but a challenge, articulated in certain pockets of Catholic life, but effectively interrupted in its ability to truly shape the ethos of the church in the U.S. The development of the preferential option for culture in Latino theology remains today one of the most promising contexts in the Theological Academy, where the challenges of the preferential option for meet the realities of lo cotidiano of a church reticent to fully embrace the task of being and becoming divine love incarnate in the realities of others. While my colleagues throughout the day are doing their part to highlight key insights of Latino theology, my goals are to bring the dominant narrative of the U.S. context into the conversation as a deep challenge to the preferential option, as well as soil in which Latino theology might serve as seed, fertilizer, water, and sun for the flower and fruit of a truly liberative garden. Firstly, it is important to identify how I define the context of this phrase, the preferential option for. As the incarnational principle of divine love, the phrase demands a location or relocation, a cartography or map making for discipleship that indicates that presence, moving to, and being in a place outside of privilege, where there is suffering and also rejoicing, is central to being the church. This preferential option is a preferential option for, essentially bringing the other in her or his fullness into the center of Christian discipleship. To speak of a preferential option demands cartographic, epistemic, hermeneutic, and praxeological dimensions, a process that echoes the rubric of See, Judge, Act, so central to Catholic social thought in the second half of the 20th century. Today, I focus particularly on the first two tasks, the cartographic relocation task and the epistemic one, and the ways in which a context of political, economic, and social privilege truly impedes the right development of a church capable of making such a preferential option. I believe that in their comments, the presenters throughout the day very nicely flesh out the hermeneutical and praxeological dimensions. As an incarnational principle, the preferential option is a Jesuitic concept. It describes the return to the Jesus of the Gospels in Vatican II, and specifically the historical Jesus who is God with us in a specific place, in a specific history, marked by imperial domination and dynamics of political and cultural conflict. That echoes some of Orlando Espin's comments this morning about the peasant Jesus and his fate in his time in history. In other words, there is a place, a location in which we make the preferential option, a cartographic task to being church that demands that we place ourselves with the suffering, and that establishing where we stand is a prior task to being able to see in the rubric See, Judge, Act. The challenge of the context of privilege in the U.S. So go with me back a few years, and immediately after 9/11, the attacks of 9/11, 2001, on the World Trade Center, then President Bush told us that a sure way to beat the terrorists was, do you remember this? To fly to Disney and go shopping, right? That was the way he garnered American stamina and presence before the terrorist attacks. Now, that commercialism may have subsided a bit since the economic crash of 2008, but what he was doing was he was driving at something very deep in American culture, an ethos that had been developed throughout the centuries of our nation into what that moment in history where he was standing at. These comments were tapping deeper ideological and philosophical commitments about prevalent definitions of the good life that have developed in this nation over the past. If the cartographic task of the preferential option demands decentering and relocation, physical preferably, but also spiritually and politically, to be with those who suffer, then this key project and challenge falls entirely flat when it reaches U.S. shores. Instead, deep in the psyche and soul of privilege, there is a preferential option for the self, a preferential option for one truth for myself and those who think like me, a preferential option for order, a particularly established and defined order, and inevitably, a preferential option for the culture wars. Where there is privilege, the quest for human fulfillment and being in community is marked by a spirit of domination, neo-colonial drive to silence the everyday struggles that question the sacred dichotomies of the public square: left, right, pro-choice, pro-life, legal, illegal. You can name all the different fissures at the culture wars. In a culture of privilege, a preferential option for order, for example, prioritizes notions of what is the good life that draws its legitimacy from the law of domination, individual rights, and the perpetuation of the status quo. The prevalent vision of the human being as the individual in full possession of her or his distinct destiny, able to build herself up totally through her own effort, feels immensely put upon by a faith that asks that we take the context of the other as if it was of existential import to our own destiny. The culture wars of privilege present cultural, economic, and philosophical challenges to performing the cartographic task of remapping one's being and becoming in the context of a larger sense of history and encounter and communion with others. Here I lift up some of what was said this morning about the vast history of Latino presence in the U.S. that does not begin with what media would like us to remember as crossing of the U.S.-Mexico border, but that in fact how that border was established and how that land was conquered and colonized has a lot to do with that broader sense of history. The case of climate change and environmental crisis offers a particularly poignant and comprehensive example. Many of us are eager, some giddy, some nervous, about the promised papal encyclical on the environment. But already in the U.S., a conversation similar to the one that occurred immediately after the U.S. bishop's pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, and John Paul II's Centesimus Annus is taking place. This conversation is marked by the ill-labeled left-right dichotomy of being Christian in the U.S., where an issue such as climate change is viewed as a moral challenge, yes, by some, but not others. Deeper than whether we view this as a moral challenge is a direct link between the question of climate change, its causes and how to address it, with dominant notions of the good life, private property and industry, personal freedom, and the proper role of government, consumerism, and other elements of U.S. civil religion. Conversion and action toward an understanding of a shared destiny for humanity on environmental concerns succumbs to the quicksand morass of the public square and the contentious conversations therein, making it almost impossible to reach the transforming and crucial first step of changing one's location for theological and ethical reflection. The same occurs with other idols of the culture wars, such as immigration, the Affordable Care Act, same-sex marriage, and economic inequality. The cartographic task, the task of placing oneself squarely among the ones who suffer, and which allows us to perform the epistemic task of seeing lo cotidiano in the lives outside of privilege and power, becomes an impossibility for the majority of U.S. Christians. So let me suggest that Latino theology bears a corrective impulse to these culture wars. The cartographic and epistemic turn hinges on the ability to break from a neo-colonial modality of conquest and domination. In the culture wars, the main weapon of domination is a self-fulfilling notion of truth for me and my own that runs roughshod over those who do not see or experience the world in the same way as those living in privilege. Throughout the past 4 decades, Latino theology has offered currents and visions that help identify, resist, and interrupt the idolatry of the culture wars, calling out the ways in which these leave real victims in its wake, stultifying and stunting a discipleship that naturally and organically is supposed to opt for others. Let me just lift up one example, very recent, and I presented this slide a few weeks ago at another forum. But remember this past summer, 2 events, one in the spring, one in the summer. One is, the one in the spring was the April Mass led by U.S. Catholic bishops at the border. And how really some of the images of that Mass I don't know of a soul that wouldn't have been moved by those images, except for whom those were a politicizing of the liturgy. And a lot of voices were raised about that. And the second image that is related was a few months later in June when media attention was brought to the crisis of minor immigrants at the border and the protests and the turning away of buses full of minors and young families headed either to Arizona or to California to be housed as refugees. So understand the tension that this very question it presents in the U.S. context. On the one hand, Catholic bishops speaking very loudly to the reception and hospitality to the stranger, to the suffering, to refugees, and on the other hand, the very politicized notion of who belongs in, who is out, under all of it, under the guise of Christianity, under the guise of being faithful, being believers in this nation, but under the conditions, instead of Tillich saying, under the conditions of existence, under the conditions of the culture wars, because that's our existence. The preferential option for culture in Latino theology resists this neo-imperialist drive for domination by locating the self in the historical and transhistorical journey of the human spirit toward freedom, flourishing, encounter, and communion. The anthropological work of Roberto Goizueta, Michel Gonzalez, and Miguel Diaz, for example, witness to this shared journey. Latino theology exposes the violent consequences of the Enlightenment project of autonomous self-completion when elevated to idolatry within privileged contexts. It transforms the the idolatry of my truth only to a tapestry of truths, weaving in a divine arc of truth and justice and built in the messy holy of the everyday. So thank you, Cardinal Ravasi, for the image of the divine arcoiris, the rainbow. The task of autonomous self-completion is transformed to notions of being and becoming in a human journey of life toward freedom, communion, and acompañamiento. It replaces the primacy of legal order for order as the spirit's journey toward fulfillment of a larger story, a holy and cosmic story, as Alex Garcia Rivera would say, where the dignity of each builds on the dignity of the whole, from the most personal to the cosmic whole. As such, Latino theology resists the drive for domination and homogenization in any form. I conclude. By interrupting privilege, Latino theology enables and empowers the cartographic and epistemic tasks at the heart of the preferential option 4. Engaging and realizing the cartographic and epistemic tasks as a church marked by the preferential option, rather than an option for culture wars, we enable the birthing of a transformed church, one for whom the culture wars reveal themselves to be the idols of a privileged, comfortable, and selfish understanding of the good life, and therefore violent to the humanity of all. By enabling the cartographic and epistemic tasks of a preferential option for culture, for history, for the racial and religious other, for the poor, for youth, for migrants, for the unemployed, for women and the gendered other, for creation, Latino theology encourages the decentering practices necessary for resisting the neo-colonial dominating impulse of privilege. Instead, a sense of shared journey, encounter, and communion is cultivated and enriched, preparing the way for transformative and graced experiences of faith and discipleship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MT. That was wonderful. Sometimes I wish that, it's not that I don't want, yes, part of me wants not only this room full of people, but sometimes I think increasingly my service abroad has given me the sense that somehow or other, and I know that many of us here in this room share this feeling, that this kind of theology is not meant to, in these kinds of reflections, are not meant to remain in this room. And that at times, unfortunately, we are unable to extend, our voices and our invitations to dialogue into the city of Chicago. But, it'd be great if we can, go down to Millennium Park and carry out this conversation in the midst of the city, perhaps in between the two baseball stadiums, Carmen. But part of my frustration, I honestly have to say, in having seen this at the international level, is something that I carry now, not only domestically but now internationally, is that at times we're just talking to ourselves, amongst ourselves, and somehow or other, I don't know the recipe to extend the conversation that needs to occur for the transformation of the broader community, our cities, and our nation. Because, the cultural wars are a reality, but how to transform that is a big challenge. Nestor Medina is a Latino-Canadian theologian, so another hyphen. He is assistant professor of theology and culture at Regent University. And Nestor is, among us today, one of the leading scholars on mestizaje. And so we are fortunate that we can call him now to this podium for him to share his thoughts. And, the title of his presentation is Deciphering Mestizaje, Encrypting Lived Faith. Thank you, Nestor.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, still morning. Good morning, everybody. Not often do I stand in front of so many Catholics because I hang out more with Catholic charismatics and Pentecostals and evangelicals. So this is a unique opportunity and honor for me to be here. And not often, and probably I'll never again, will have such an official, such high status in front of me as my audience. So Cardinal Ravasi is really an honor for me for you to be here and listen to what I have to say. If you read Latino or Latina theology, one of the terms that you're going to stumble on again and again is the notion of mestizaje. It repeatedly shows up. And the problem with that is, what does that mean? How do we define it? How do we understand it? So what I'm going to try to do this morning is to do three things. One, to provide you with a set of definitions of what I think, at least for this presentation, mestizaje means. The second thing that I want to do is do a kind of a historical connection. And the third thing that I want to do is to see how or what does this all have to do with theology. Because at the end of the day, this is the reason we are here. So the multivalent category of mestizaje, and that's how you pronounce it, mestizaje, for the purpose of this presentation has at least four meanings. One, the biological intermixture that took place between indigenous communities and Spanish Portuguese peoples as a result of the Spanish Portuguese invasions of the Americas and the subsequent colonial societies that started at the end of the 15th century. And here I want to kind of begin with parentheses to emphasize that the whole other story of the intermixture between African slaves and African descendants and Spanish and Portuguese, which runs along the discourse of mulataje, is a whole other aspect of Latino theology that needs to be developed, that has not yet been fully developed, but that needs to be acknowledged. Nevertheless, let me get back to mestizaje. The second meaning that I want to bring out to your attention is the mestizaje, that is the historical condition of multiple cultural intermixture, is highlighted. On one hand, what it does is the realization that Latino cultural traditions stem from multiple cultural sources. That is indigenous, African, and European. And there I want to emphasize Spanish, Portuguese, Anglo, and growing. And on the other hand, I want to say that mestizaje then contributes to the unmasking of cultural assimilationist and colonizing social and religious structures that discriminate against Latinos and Latinas on the basis of being mixed. Third meaning. If that's the case, then mestizaje, for me, can also appropriately serve as a cipher for identifying the complex, existential, liminal identity in social spaces inhabited by Latinos and Latinas. That is, the dynamic and fluid character of Latino culture never fully fitting in pervasive, airtight cultural frames. Latino theology and cultures cannot be enclosed in airtight, nicely sanitized frames. And fourth, mestizaje also points to the practice of code switching, the seamless alternate use of two or three cultures, traditions, and epistemologies. More specifically, the complex process of socialization of linguistic code switching and speaking, in the words of Carmen Nanko, in Spanglish, thus breaking the protocol of monolingual grammar codes and syntax, or what is usually considered proper speaking. This multiple, or these four uses of mestizaje, I want to say, find themselves expressed in religious traditions. Mestizaje operates as the key for unlocking the richness of the Latino experiences of faith in God. Yes, as I mentioned already, there are important limitations and challenges that need to be considered when speaking about the condition, notion, and category of mestizaje, and those cannot be set aside. Nevertheless, I want to argue that mestizaje marks the point of intersection between Latino theology's synchronous act of deciphering and encrypting. Deciphering, I mean, in the sense of unraveling and unmasking the intersection of oppression and exclusion based on culture and racialization of Latinos and Latinas. And encrypting in the sense of recodifying the resilient, persistent, even obstinate lived faith of Latino communities. To be more succinct, the refusal by Latino communities not to stop believing, because to cease to believe means to cease to live. So mestizaje is not an innocent category, and it is not also an abstract idea cooked within the intellectual playfulness of categories, like notions such as hybridity. Rather, it is rooted in the numerous, messy, and often violent historical human exchanges. It is a cipher that encompasses the complex set of intersecting forces, both positive and negative, both emerging from love and sometimes of violence, that constitute Latino and Latina communities, and which serve as the reservoir of theological wisdom, knowledge, and meaning for Latino theology. So what is, now I'm moving to my second point, what is underneath a mestizaje, I want to say, is that mestizaje help us identify our multiple disparate historical origins. And here I want to emphasize three historical currents. And this has already been mentioned, but so bear with me for being a little bit repetitive. The first historical current is that of the Spanish and the Portuguese invasions. So our history as Latinos and Latinas did not start at the birth of the United States, but it goes way back, much back, 500 centuries. Yeah, 500 centuries is a bit of an exaggeration, but 500 years back. And the outcome of that, not only the mixed people that stem from that, but also the decimation, or in the words of Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, the culture side of that was experienced by the natives, the indigenous communities of the Americas then, and also I want to say the cultural side that the African communities and slaves experienced. The second current, historical current, is the U.S. expansionist imperial attitudes. The communities directly related to the U.S. imperial aspirations, and at its kind of moment of inception for Latino theology, were the Mexican Americans, the Cuban Americans, and the Puerto Rican Americans. That has diversified greatly now. And I don't think we can so quickly just reduce it to these three groups. So I'm emphasizing here the tendency of U.S. interventionism. So that is also part of our history. And the third history that I want to emphasize is our present, and since the actual Mexico-U.S. War in 1858. From there, the history and present condition of marginalization and discrimination in the social context, which is also, by the way, part of the academic marginalization that we experienced. So who we are and how we exist in a space of marginalization, both in society but also in the academia, is part of this longer, larger, bigger, broader history of marginalization. But I also want to, and this has been also said a couple of times, that we are not trying to romanticize. And by not romanticizing, I also want to emphasize that there is a historical issue in Latino and Latina Latino and Latina communities, and that is that in our communities, we also have a history of internal racialized hierarchies that we have inherited from the colonial past. And that there are still internal racialized ideological divisions that tend to organize and classify Latinos and Latinas hierarchically, linguistically, nationally, and culturally. And that must be confronted and dismantled as well. So by using mestizaje, Latinos and Latinas are now also becoming challenged to unmask the ways in which oppression and discrimination takes place within our communities. So, in a way then, I want to suggest that what we are doing is a kind of a historiographical move. A historiographical move by which we acknowledge that we cannot do theology without engaging the historical background out of which we come. And that the pretension of any theology to speak theology, quote, theology, in the abstract without engaging its own history is rather, I wanted to say a lot of things, but let me hold my tongue there and just say the Latino theology embodies a good example of what it means to do theology seriously, taking seriously the history, our own history. So then let me get to point 3. So what does this have to do with theology? At the end of the day, this is what we are here for. And I think at least 4 points would be that mestizaje allows for the conceptualization of a new vision of humanity. Mestizaje also allows for understanding culture as a critical theological component. And you have already heard, mestizaje also help us take more seriously popular religion and also embody a new hermeneutics. I only focus on the first 2 because the other 2 have already been spoken about, and also because I'm running out of time. In terms of the new humanity, I want to say that mestizaje reveals the providential growing creation of a new humanity that bears the potential of ethno-racial and cultural coexistence. The humanity of Jesus, and Cardinal Ravasi has already mentioned this, and I'm really happy that there is some sense of coinciding in this. The humanity of Jesus is reclaimed as mestiza. The incarnation was the result of mestizaje of the divine and the human, would Luis Pedraja say. So Jesus' identity was the result of the cultural mestizaje pervasive in the Galilean in the Jesus Galilean context, as Virgilio Elizondo say. But I want to say that mestizaje must not be understood merely as a blending of Jesus' divine and human natures, but rather a collaboration of the human and the divine in the construction of a new humanity able to reflect the divine imaging. So the mestizaje that took place between the divine and the human in the incarnation serves as the pattern for human existence and coexistence with other cultural communities. In light of that, then, there is room for the articulation of a new understanding of the human based on intermixture. So this model breaks with all arbitrary prescribed social, economic, political, cultural boundaries that prevent many from reaching full humanity. Thus, the mestizo humanity marks the intentional unfolding of the inherited damaging social stereotypes and culturalized ethno-racial markers that separate human collectives. So mestizaje, then, I want to propose, contradicts traditional notions of a universal, abstract idea of the human and replaces them with notions of contextually located and culturally conditioned realities that define humanity. The human being is then culturally bound and conditioned, Orlando Espin would say. So my final point in terms of culture as critical theological component. With mestizaje, with the notion of mestizaje, mixed cultures are celebrated. Culture is celebrated not as a series of elite social tools and entitlements, but as the very fabric of how people view the world, understand reality, confront misery, experience and process pain, happiness, and conceive and approach the divine. Culture is the inextricably linked series of codes and segments of codes by which people make sense of life, interact with each other and the world, and approach the divine. Because of mestizaje, we can say that culture is the conditio sine qua non of theological reflection. Once again, Orlando Espin says, all theological reflections are culturally shaped and conditioned. Thus, the emphasis on culture for me, and I know it's been said here otherwise, but let me just digress a little bit or go somewhere else. The emphasis on culture for me goes deeper than contextual reflections. Focus on culture also identifies specific epistemological sources, such as fiesta or customs, and the particular ways in which we construct theological knowledge en conjunto. It allows us to reclaim those long-standing traditions and sources of knowledge that as of yet remain absent in traditional approaches to theology, such as orality and dreams, for example. Mestizaje help us chart a new trajectory of theological sources and reclaim our own indigenous, African, and Latin American intellectual reservoirs that do not always pass by the Enlightenment, and I want to say, and do not need to pass by the Enlightenment. Those are not only potential, but actual epistemologies. They are a great cloud of witnesses that can help us in revising, recreating, and reimagining the theological task. So emphasis on culture is not a Shakespearean type of Caliban. Yeah, I also know some English literature. And by that I mean learning the master's tool to speak back. Rather, mestizaje is our own categorical reconfiguration of disruptive shibboleths that create new tools and create new spaces for thinking the reality of the divine from the perspective of our cultures. So let me just close because I'm getting too excited. The theological articulation of mestizaje points to the radical intersection of cultural, racial-ethnic, gender, and identity issues. It unmasks the non-innocence of all processes of theological reflection, and it unburies the historical skeletons in the closet of traditional theological discourses as it carves out new social, theological, ideological, and identity spaces for reclaiming the multiple sources of our complex identities. Mestizaje exposes the fundamental quality of theological reflection as emerging from the incarnated character of faith. In other words, it is as people live and express their faith in God that they engage in the radical, uneven, unfinished, and continuing process of mesticization. Thank you.
Thank you, Nestor. This is a as you were critiquing, that's part of our internal critiques that are necessary, precisely because we ourselves have judged some above others in certain ways, in certain feelings, in certain intellects. And so you have invited us, as others have in this community, to begin to think about our own issues, and not just the issues that lie outside of our communities. With that, of course, continuing to reflect upon the ongoing challenges that are beyond us and around us. And so before we go to lunch, and we're going to go lunch very, very soon, I just want to take a couple of questions from this group of panelists. Yes, Brian.
All right, so I'm a sociologist, so I preface this because it's a little bit sort of like where I'm coming from. I didn't see the connection, and it might be there. So I think my question is directed towards, isn't it Naomi? I'm sorry.
MT.
That's not, MT. Okay, well, good. So I really liked your discussion about the preferential option 4 and the way that it forces us to change perspective, to sort of go outside of ourselves. But what I was confused with was when you were saying how the culture wars are sort of predicated and rooted in domination. And so my sort of conception of culture wars and where I'm coming from, I didn't see how that link was concretely made. And so I just wanted to see if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, no, and I didn't, sorry. I didn't do it explicitly in the paper. Yes, hello? Okay. Those involved, or those who participate, and for whom the issues at the fissure of the culture wars are very dear, would probably not identify them as such. But the reason they play into domination is, just preliminarily, is twofold. One is they stultify discipleship. They stunt discipleship at an encounter that does not allow conversation to move beyond this absolute notion of truth that has been defined by particular parties. So on the issue, and that has been defined historically to benefit certain notions of order. So take the environmental question. That's whether we believe we are climate change believers or the climate change deniers, whether we think it's anthropological activity that is causing climate change, the deep understandings of private property, the role of government in regulating property, consumption, production, etc. These sort of very economic and of a particular economic way of life, visions that have been really legitimized by church and state, throughout the history of the U.S., really begin to shape how people of faith encounter that question. So even though it's a moral question about how we're going to be good stewards of this earth, we are letting these notions of sort of Christianized or baptized notions of private property inform the debate.
Thank you again for coming to Loyola University and participating in this unprecedented conversation with the Cardinal and with some wonderful voices in Latino theology. This afternoon, the schedule will call for theologizing Latinamente in the sense of taking some of the central themes in Latino theology with respect to doctrinal perspectives on Jesus, Mary, and God, and providing some food for thought in these areas. At the end of the first session, we will take a break, and then we will invite Cardinal Ravasi and other participants to join us up here, and then we will have a conversation amongst ourselves with the Cardinal and with all of you. And so this afternoon, I am very honored to be sharing this presentation table with two friends and colleagues. The first one taught at Loyola University of Chicago many years ago, and so actually his face, it's not unfamiliar to all of you. The second one was actually a graduate of Loyola University of Chicago. So, and now and the third one is the current professor of Loyola University of Chicago. So we all have these connections to this place. And so we have all walked with one another and walked with this place in various ways. Roberto Goizueta is the Margaret O'Brien Flatley Professor of Catholic Theology at Boston College. And he joins us from Boston, that other Jesuit institution, to share his perspectives on Jesus, our companion. Dr. Naomi De Anda is a assistant professor at the University of Dayton, Ohio, and she joins us to speak on Yo Caridad del Cobre is not my Guadalupe. Thank you, Naomi, for reminding me about that. But let us share La Leche, a look at Latino theological roots in images of breast milk. And finally, yours truly from Loyola University of Chicago will speak on the theme of the mystery of God. And the title of my presentation is God Who Crosses, Migration, Exile, and the Preferential Option for the Marginalized and Oppressed. Roberto, please.
Thank you so much, Miguel. I'm very grateful to Ambassador Diaz, Miguel, and to all of you for being here. I'm very grateful to Loyola for inviting me. I'm deeply grateful to Your Eminence, Cardinal Ravasi, for your presence and for your support here with us today. I'm especially grateful to be back at Loyola after a number of years. It's great to be back on this campus, although it looks very different from when I was here. I was just commenting to somebody that Loyola has finally discovered the lake. So this beautiful building is just in a gorgeous view. I can see why the shades have been pulled down. But it's a beautiful campus, and it's great to see old friends. Well, maybe not old friends, long-time young friends. And great to be here among my colleagues and friends in the Latino theological community. Pope Francis has repeatedly insisted that the option for the poor must be an option for the God of the poor. For it is through the poor that God has chosen to be revealed to us. This is what has been called the mysticism of the poor. In Evangelii Gaudium, the Holy Father writes, quote, "We are not only called to feed them, clothe them, and shelter them, but to find Christ in them, to lend our voice to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them," unquote. As Gustavo Gutierrez repeatedly reminds us, the option for the poor is a theocentric option. We are called to make a preferential option for the poor, not because the poor are necessarily good, but because God is good. It is an explicitly theological step. Who is the God revealed in the faith of the poor, the religious practices of the poor? And how is my own faith, our own faith, challenged or deepened by that God? At least if we claim to be making a preferential option for the poor. If it is to have any meaning in the light of the people's own self-understanding, an option for the poor must be an option for the God of the poor. I learned this lesson a number of years ago, many years ago now, over 20. I remember when Virgilio Elizondo, a name that has come up here before, one of the great figures, so-called father of U.S. Latino theology, Virgilio Elizondo was rector of San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio, Texas, a number of years ago. And he called a number of us, theologians and other scholars, he invited us to come and share and participate in the Holy Week celebrations in his cathedral parish in San Antonio. To be there with the people, to participate in the Holy Week celebrations, which we, as you know, will be celebrating next week. And then to reflect on that experience through the lens of our own disciplines, in my case, theology. What do we learn from the faith, the lived faith of the community? I remember anticipating that time with the community in San Fernando Cathedral and expecting that I would see a people who were very much focused, as I know Latino communities are, on Good Friday, on the celebration of Good Friday and the way of the cross and accompanying Jesus on the way to Calvary. And like a good theologian, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if the people emphasized or focused more on Easter rather than Good Friday? I mean, after all, Good Friday is about suffering and pain. Doesn't that really lead to isn't it kind of depressing to place so much emphasis on Good Friday as so many Catholic communities around the world do? So that's what I was expecting to find. I was expecting to come in and to try to show the people how important it is to really emphasize Easter more than Good Friday. I remember after accompanying the people on the way of the cross on that Good Friday, coming away very much changed in my own perception of what I had just experienced. What I discovered was not a people who were depressed or who were somber or who were kind of wallowing in suffering, but on the contrary, a people who came away from that process of walking on the way to Calvary with Jesus, who came away with a sense of hope, empowerment, dignity. I really experienced an energized people. So I was beginning to do what the Holy Father challenges us to do, which is to try to learn from the faith of the poor. So then I began to ask myself, well, what's going on here? Why is it that what on the surface would appear to be something that ought to be discouraged is in fact something that seems to be liberating and hope-giving? Why did an activity that focused so much on pain and suffering seem to generate so much hope and confidence? And I came to realize that the reason for that is that the hope and the empowerment and the energy comes from the experience of Christ's presence with us in our struggles and in our suffering. So that the source of hope of the people, the source of liberation, the source of empowerment, is not simply the resurrection experienced on Sunday, on Easter, but the resurrection experienced on Good Friday itself, when we are not abandoned to our suffering, to our pain, to our isolation, but are indeed accompanied by a Christ who walks with us just as we walk with him. Paradoxically, at the very moment when we experience ourselves as most alone, if we continue to reach out and cry out, as Jesus himself did on the cross, my God, we experience the fact that love, in the end, conquers isolation. The resurrection, then, is not simply the victory of life over death. It's the victory of communion over isolation, over estrangement. I like to tell a story of a good friend of all of ours, Father Arturo Bañuelas. Arturo Bañuelas is a priest of a very successful parish, or had been for many years, in El Paso, Texas. And Arturo tells a story of visiting the house of one of his parishioners, a mother, and entering the living room and seeing above the mantel there in the living room a picture, as you often find in Latino homes, a picture of the Divino Rostro, the Holy Countenance of Christ, Christ on the cross with crown of thorns, blood streaming down his face, downcast. And Arturo says when he saw that, he thought to himself, geez, it must be very depressing to be living here and constantly coming across this painting of this suffering Jesus, day in and day out. So he says after he went back to his rectory, he found a picture of a smiling Jesus, a more hopeful Jesus, a resurrected Jesus. And he said a few weeks later when he came back to visit this mother, he brought with him as a gift this more hopeful looking Jesus and gave it to her. She thanked him, gracias padre. She thanked him, picked it up, and put it in the corner of the room. He was a little perplexed. He was hoping that she would take it and replace the other depressing picture with this one. So he asked her, I was really hoping you would replace, the one you have there with this one. I think this one really would be much more uplifting to you. And she looked at him and she said, Father, my husband runs around with me and he drinks a lot. I have a daughter who hangs out with the wrong kind of people and she's into drugs and other things. My son is involved in gangs and hardly ever comes home. Sometimes I just don't feel like getting up in the morning. And when that happens, I kneel before the Divino Rostro and he gives me the strength to keep going. I think that story depicts precisely the meaning of resurrection and how resurrection does not involve ultimately the erasure or the forgetting of crucifixion, but is in fact what is encountered even in the midst of crucifixion when we are not alone. Nevertheless, we live in a society that in its individualism actually seeks, values, and glorifies the isolated individual as the model of what it means to be human. To be a full human being is to be self-sufficient, autonomous, and therefore alone. The ideal individual is the one who is left alone. To be free is to be left alone. The result, unsurprisingly, is a society full of self-sufficient individuals who are lonely, depressed, and paradoxically addicted to virtually anything. But we're not even aware that we're lonely, depressed, addicted, and broken, because, after all, we're supposedly self-sufficient, independent, and thus happy. The thriving markets for psychotherapy, antidepressants, every conceivable kind of drug, and self-help techniques would suggest otherwise. It's not in urban ghettos that we find the highest rates of suicide, but in wealthy suburban enclaves. And I would submit precisely because they are enclaves. An individualistic society will inevitably become a necrophilic society that fears connection, communion, love, and thus fears life itself. It is against such an individualistic culture that Latina Catholics offer the hope of communion, the hope of a God who is credible because that God is near us, is with us in our struggles. We have dignity not because we are self-sufficient, but because we are loved. I was recently watching an interview of the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who said, we are not loved because we are beautiful because we are loved. That is the central message, I would say, of Jesus Christ. We are beautiful, all of us are beautiful because we are loved. I'm reminded speaking of lo cotidiano, I'm reminded a story that I also like to tell a lot about my son. I learn a lot from my children. Great theologians, often children. I remember my son when he must have been 6 or 7 years old, and I was getting ready to put him to bed. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he looks at me and he says, "Papi, what's more important, love or life?" And I thought to myself, a budding theologian, no doubt. And I was kind of taken aback, and then I said, "Well, you know, son, I think probably life, because if you're not alive, you can't love." And he looked at me and said, "You know, I really don't think so." He says, "Because without love, we wouldn't be alive." There's a book in there somewhere. It left me thinking, and of course he was absolutely right. That is, what makes life possible is love. What gives us our dignity is not what we own, what job we have, how much money we make, where we live. It is that we are loved unconditionally by a God who loves all people unconditionally. And that's the fundamental message of the preferential option for the poor. God's love is unconditional, utterly gratuitous. There's nothing we can do to earn it. Jesus' resurrection, then, is but the confirmation of what has already occurred on Good Friday, when, though experiencing himself abandoned by his friends and even by God, Jesus refuses to despair, but continues to cry out, my God, my God." Those 4 words are the thin thread that continues to bind the Son and the Father on the cross. But that thread is ultimately never broken. Easter, then, is the confirmation of the fact that abandonment, isolation, and estrangement do not have the last word, that reconciliation, companionship, and love are ultimately victorious. The cross is already the birthplace of the resurrection. Easter is already celebrated on Good Friday, when we are not abandoned to our suffering and when we do not abandon Jesus to his. Thus, Jesus' resurrection implies not just the conquest of death, but the conquest of isolation. The message of the resurrection is that in the end, we're not alone, and we will never be left alone. We are loved, and that love manifests itself most intimately in Christ's nearness to us in our suffering at the very moment when we feel most alone and abandoned. The question answered by the resurrection, then, is not just, is there life after death, but is there life before death? Ironically, it is those in our world who appear to be the most abandoned who are often the ones who experience most profoundly the reality of Christ and thus experience the goodness and value of life before death. They ought to be the ones attracted to modern atheism. Yet atheism arises not among the poor, but among the so-called privileged and comfortable. Atheism arises among those whose isolation from suffering isolates them from life because it isolates them from love. Our task as Christians, then, is to participate in Christ's own presence and companionship with the poor, to discover there not only their liberation, but our own as well. We opt for the poor not only to save the poor, we cannot save the poor. We opt for the poor in order to save ourselves, or more appropriately, in order to open ourselves to God's unconditional, gratuitous, and saving love. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. All of us here know that you have always invited us to caminar con Jesús, and we have been grateful for that over the years. I now invite my colleague Naomi de Anda to step up and give us some reflections on La Caridad, Guadalupe, but most importantly, La Leche.
Actually, I need to change one thing, which I had already written down, but Roberto reminded me. So, What a wonderful day to celebrate it is today. And it's good to be back on this campus after I hadn't been here since graduation, so very nice. Your Caridad del Cobre is not our Guadalupe, but let us share la leche. Guadalupe was named as the patroness of the Americas by Pope Pius XII on October 12, 1945. As a Mexican-American Catholic, this knowledge gave me great joy and pride as a child. Guadalupe had her own big party with a giant altar, roses, songs, chocolate, tamales, buñuelos, the Mexican kind, and the respect of a good hour on our knees praying the rosary. These are among the earliest religious memories from when I was a young child. We would gather at my tia Esther's home in Juarez for the celebration. She, who had no biological children of her own, became the matriarch of our family when it came to Guadalupe and the celebration of her feast day. Although I continue to be a devout Guadalupana, I wish to highlight a misconception which seems to appear because Guadalupe has been declared the patroness of the Americas. This title of patroness of the Americas becomes conflated with Latino and Marian devotions and quickly leads to comments like, Costa Ricans and Mexican Americans are the same, or by giving a Puerto Rican an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe because of an assumed devotion as a Guadalupana. The problem of thinking that Latinos are monolithic seems to tie to the notion that Guadalupe, as patroness of the Americas, also means that all Latinos have devotions to her and no other Marian image. Yet the members of these various groups of Latinos know very well that each country of origin and many times each region has devotions to its own distinct Marian images, most of which carry their own local stories of apparitions and miracles, such as Caridad del Cobre of Cubans and Nuestra Señora de Chinquinquirá of Colombians. One image, however, does have roots across various Latin American communities and Latinos as we bring them forward, and their histories, yet with her own particularities. Nursing and lactating Madonnas can be found throughout what we now call the Americas, from Peru to Mexico, Puerto Rico to La Florida, with confirmed dates from the early 17th century, but may have arrived earlier in the Americas. These Marian images were brought to the Americas to also watch over the childbearing and rearing of those living in the region, as well as a way of union with God. Yet images of divine lactating and nursing breasts are not exclusive to the Spanish or to Christianity. Various deities and images of lactating and nursing breasts can be found in indigenous cosmologies of the Americas. Therefore, these Marian images seem to have been more easily accepted by various native communities as another goddess image. I will outline 5 particular instances of these nursing images related with divinity. The Codex Borgia, originally painted in the central highlands of what is now Mexico, exists as one of the most complete manuscripts predating 1492. This first panel of images is found in the Codex Borgia's calendar of 20 deities and 80 days. The last 5 of the 20 deities are nursing goddesses. And the Codex Borgia is today housed in the Apostolic Library of the Vatican in Rome. So we're going to go through the 5 images just very quickly for the sake of time, and then if there's time in the Q&A or other times, we can look at it again. The first one is Mayahuel. She is the goddess of maguey, pulque, and excess, and she's considered to be part of the direction of the west, so she's kind of centered in that place. Tlatzoteo is the goddess of filth, earth, and guilt, and her directionality is that of the south. She's kind of put there. And here you see the various images, and you can see they start with the major goddess and then some other form nursing off of it, and then the four other gods and goddesses underneath. Mictecaxihuitlal, as her setting in the third day of the last 5 days in the cycle, she represents the center. She is the connection between all of the other four directions and is linking them to the gods above and below the disk of the earth. She is the goddess of death and the underworld. Chalchehuitleque is the goddess of running water, the nature goddess. She is also the prime female deity and that of the east. And Xochiquetzal is the goddess of flower, the quetzal feather, pleasure and indulgence, and sex, and of the north. In this cosmological perspective, milk is understood to come from many parts of creation. Hence, the 20 days of this 80-day liturgical cycle are dedicated to these lactating goddesses. And it's mainly for sustenance, but these are the last days, so then the whole cycle starts again of kind of incubation and then birth and regrowth and sustenance. The roots of María de la Leche in Madrid, Spain. The history of Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto in San Agustin, Florida has been traced back to the story from Madrid, Spain. The story goes something as follows. In the year 1615, a drunk and rather crazy soldier carried through Arenal Street an image of Our Lady made of old wood, which he was hauling with a rope. He had brought it from other areas of Europe, where many Protestants live, and more than likely from where he came. He had brought it to Spain with the charge to give it to a man of the court. But when the soldier arrived, the man was not in Madrid. The soldier, since he had the image solely for financial gain, thinking about his compensation, and because he did not find the man for whom it was destined, he was dragging the image with a rope. Seeing how he was handling the image with such disrespect, a woman gave him an ounce of gold to buy it, and took it home, where she venerated it with much devotion. On her deathbed, she ordered that this image be given to the monastery of San Martin, where she was venerated as the Virgin of milk and happy delivery and pregnant women. This famous image was one of the ones that the queens of Spain venerated when they found themselves in the state of pregnancy. And the story should be understood as a narrative account rather than a historical one, because the date of 1615 seems to be later than the original date of when the goddess arrived in St. Augustine, Florida, somewhere around 1606. And this is not the original image. It's just an image I found at the University of Dayton that was a wooden Mary that I thought, how interesting. She's just kind of hanging out here. Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto, Misión Nombre de Dios, St. Augustine, Florida. A copy of the little statue of a nursing Mary of Madrid was believed to have been brought over with the mariners in one of the ships that docked in St. Augustine. A small area of land on Misión Nombre de Dios, now known as America's most sacred acre, was the home to this devotion by those Spaniards, as well as the indigenous who were converted to Christianity and lived on and off the mission. This original statue is believed to be in Cuba, where it was sent during impending British invasion. St. Augustine was part of the Cuban Archdiocese at the time. Although multiple searches have been made for this statue, it has never been found. Except for about 80 years when the British colonized this land, the devotion to Nuestra Señora de la Leche has remained a Misión Nombre de Dios. The current chapel was built in the late 19th century with some of the stone from the original indigenous chapel, and the devotion continued and continues today. A new statue of about 12 inches was placed in the chapel in the 1930s. Today, the little chapel at Misión Nombre de Dios, dedicated to Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto, is filled with devotions and prayers. The current image found in the chapel was created and placed in its alcove somewhere in the 1970s. This about 24-inch image replaced the 1950s about 12-inch image because the bishop thought she needed to be larger. The chapel filled not only with curious tourists, but also with Catholic school children being indoctrinated into the devotion, as well as with parents, particularly mothers, giving thanks for their children, mostly infants. The tiny chapel in Florida holds quite a bit of warmth as 4 large candle holders filled with lit candles on the holders and on the floor under the holders glow silently yet powerfully. And that's my last slide, so when I come to that you'll be able to see it. Many of the candles had people's petitions written in marker on the actual candle. Some candles were left plain, lit, and accompanied with prayer. One account even told the story of how a woman and her daughter prayed at the chapel almost daily for 15 years for her daughter to conceive a child. Unfortunately, their prayers were never answered, and this miracle never granted. The current bishop, Felipe de Jesus Esteves, has declared Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto the patron saint of the Diocese of St. Augustine, Florida. Although he was mostly raised in the USA, he brought this devotion to this Mary from Cuba, his homeland. Because of this move and the desire to spread the devotion, candles, statues, rosaries, pins, prayer cards, note cards, novenas, and more may be found dedicated to Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto in the gift shop of the mission. Nuestra Señora de la Leche y Buen Parto was the image used for the Year of Faith in this diocese on their prayer cards, and at Misión Nombre de Dios, the breast of Nuestra Señora de la Leche has been covered more and more over the 3 iterations of the chapel over the 20th century. So it's just something interesting to note of how that's happening. The next one is Nuestra Señora de Belén. The original devotion to Nuestra Señora de Belén, a María de la Leche, was first introduced to Puerto Rico through a painting from the Flemish school of Rogier dan Venden. José Campeche, one of the most famous and most revered Puerto Rican artists, painted a number of copies of the image of Nuestra Señora de Belén, which hung in the church of San Jose in Old San Juan. This original image was thought to come from the Flemish artist, and numerous images of Nuestra Señora de Belén and numerous images of the Campeches reproductions still exist today. And most of them are held in private collections. One is actually belongs to the Smithsonian, but is not on display currently. The Flemish image was central to devotions of Nuestra Señora de Belén until 1972, when someone stole the image. The chapel remained imageless, but still holding the name of Nuestra Señora de Belén, and this chapel is currently undergoing restoration, and for the most part is not open to the public. But on January 3rd, 2012, an image of Nuestra Señora de Belén, a copy of the original, was returned to Old San Juan and placed in the cathedral, where she now hangs in a small chapel in the oldest part there in the cathedral. Daily devotions to her seem rare. I spent a period of hours over 3 days in the small chapel, about 3 meters by 3 meters, and found most devotions and prayers dedicated to the large crucifix that's about 8 feet tall. She's only about 2.5 feet tall. And so people would walk in and see the crucifix, and it overpowered this other image of Nuestra Señora de la Leche. Let's see. Since her return in 2012, a celebration on or around January 3rd has been held in the cathedral. Also, an active parish established in 1960 carries her name. In addition to the Flemish school and Campeche images, the Acosta private collection in Puerto Rico holds 2 images of María de la Leche, Nuestra Señora de Belén. Both of these images were created in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The larger image is part of an altarpiece, and the smaller one hung over one of the children's cribs. Both paintings date between the late 17th and early 18th century. And the owner of the collection, when I asked him if they saw this as art or still had devotions to her, he did not understand the question, because he said they both exist on our family altars. And so clearly there was no distinction for him. It was a sacred piece. He thought my question was crazy. It's okay. The third, actually the fourth now, that we're looking at is not an actual image, a visual one, it's a written one. And it's El Camino de la Leche, or the Milky Way, the path of milk. One Mexican nun, Sor Maria Ana Águeda de San Ignacio, 1695 to 1756 of Puebla, Mexico, wrote an entire theological treatise on El Camino de la Leche, outlining the path toward God through Mary's milk. Through the 4 books of Maravillas del Divino Amor, selladas con el sello de la verdad, Maria Ana adopts El Camino de la Leche as the spiritual path to develop her theological treatise. Through the image of Mary's breast, she explains connections between Mary and each person of the Trinity, with particular attention to Mary's relationship with Jesus. In this relationship, the fullness of what is human and divine comes to be known to humanity. Through this spiritual milk, humanity may also come to know and be in union with God. Maria Ana follows the medieval Trinitarian formula, where Mary is daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, and spouse of the Spirit. So then all of these also relate back to Mary's milk. And kind of in our worldview today, that makes all kinds of no sense if we try to look at it logically, but it was part of the imagination of the time. Book 3 of Maravillas is dedicated to 15 decades of the Rosary. She developed as prayerful practice on El Camino de la Leche. Through this mystery, we find such themes as the Sun, S-U-N, of justice, and fruits of the Spirit. Today I've presented you with the stories and histories, a mere slice of these images toward a theological construction of the breast and breast milk as tasty, the tenderness, painful, nourishing, and dry. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to conclude the presentations part, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back for the conversation on some reflections on the mystery of God from Latino perspectives. I've entitled my reflections, God Who Crosses, Migration, Exile, and the Preferential Option for the Marginalized and Oppressed. The contemporary retrieval and revival of the Christian doctrine of God has been characterized by an attempt to highlight the fact that central to Christian faith is the affirmation that God's life is shared life for our sake and our salvation. The question of salvation is the starting point for any Christian attempt to reflect on the mystery of God. As Walter Kasper rightly observes, and I quote, "The Christian concern is not with God in himself, but with God for us. The God of Jesus Christ, who is a God of human beings." While echoing Kasper's concern to underscore the soteriological basis for Christian reflection upon the mystery of God, Karl Rahner goes further to lament that reflection on this mystery has largely marginalized the triune and communal nature of God from dogmatic theology. Its absence can even be felt in ordinary Christian piety and experience. It is not surprising, Rahner observes, quote, that Christian piety practically remembers from the doctrine of the Incarnation only that God has become man, human, without deriving from this truth any clear message about the Trinity, end of quote. Kasper's and Rahner's theological concerns respond to highly individualistic, rationalistic, and secularized Europe-American cultures. In contrast to these cultures, Latino cultures are communal, person-centered, and deeply sacramental. Secularization, at least the kind of secularization that Kasper and Rahner have in mind and the previous Pope had in mind, are quite foreign within the world of Latino Catholicism. Moreover, The same cultures associated with exiling the Christian triune story of God from social concerns are often the same dominant cultures that have also rejected and marginalized communities of faith that stand in solidarity with this story. This has been the tragic fate of Latino Catholics in the United States. But if I have argued elsewhere, Trinitarian theology can be conceived as the story of God's dangerous border crossing through Christ and in the Spirit to provide life-giving sources. And if Latino Catholicism is par excellence a Catholicism marked by the experience of the cross and crossing over, then I would argue that Latino Catholicism offers the global church today a resource for encountering a vestigia Trinitatis. In what remains of my presentation, I turn to Latino Catholic culture to revisit the ancient but ever-relevant question, who is God for us? But more specifically, who is God for Latinoas? I understand Latino Catholic culture as a dynamic and relational affair that does not exist in isolation from other cultures. Rather, both at intra and at extra, Latino culture exists on the hyphen, in between various cultures, races, religious traditions, and human experiences. In the past 30 years, Latino theologians have turned to a rich diversity of cultural experiences in retrieving, wrestling with, and creatively appropriating sacred scripture and Catholic tradition. My central thesis is as follows. For Latinoas, God is the one crossed and the one who crosses a dangerous border. God crosses onto human life, and through the life-threatening and life-giving migrations of Christ and the Spirit, stands in solidarity with all who suffer material, spiritual, and cultural marginalization. 3 central loci will be used to support my argument. The cultural experience of Latinoas itself, here in the United States, sacred scripture, and the sacred tradition of Latino popular Catholicism. First, the cultural experience of crossing borders and the hyphen and God's hyphen. Latinos are always crossing borders, or borders have always crossed onto them. Latinos carry various crosses, many of them associated with various social ills. This experience of crossing borders, of being crossed, forms part of our distant and more recent history. Our past, as well as our present moment, is fluid and complex and reflects a grace-filled as well as a sinful history of both human interactions and relationships. Hybridity shaped our ancestors from medieval Spain, our Latin American roots, and continues to shape our present moment within the United States of America. This hybridity is not just a human issue for us to consider. It is not just a human issue that deeply impacts how we understand and relate to the world around us. This way of being in the world does not just impact our understandings of persons, community, social political life, and our civic engagements and contributions as citizens of this country. Our hyphenated sense of self carries a deeply theological significance, for it raises in many of us an ancient Christian question. If God became flesh so as to identify in every way with what is most authentically human, if God is for us and for our salvation in a culturally and historically mindful way, how is God the God of Latinos? These are not simply rhetorical questions, but questions that evoke the ancient premise, what is not assumed is not saved. The experience of crossing borders, living on the hyphen of cultures, and the discomfort, marginalization, and suffering that are often associated with these experiences characterizes the Homo Latinus of the United States. Paradoxically, as was the case with Christ, in our crosses and in the crossing of natural and humanly constructed borders, we have received life. Crossing has enabled us to encounter others, to give to and to receive from others. Crossing has enabled us to see God in our neighbors. Crossing has enabled us to see the very neighbor who lives in us as a result of our multiple hybridities. Reflecting on how this experience of encountering others has shaped the very heart of Latino theology, Fernando Segovia writes, and I quote, "Latino theology, because of its roots, cannot hide or disguise or reject mixture. For it finds that mezcolanza is life and gives life. A theology that, given its very reality and experience, cannot bypass, assimilate, or annihilate the other. For again, it finds itself that otredad, otherness, also is life and gives life." End of quote. How fitting that within Latino theology, mezcolanza, otredad, has become associated with life and with God, the ultimate giver of life. The God we Latinos confess, together with the God of our ancestors, is the one who does not melt away difference, but embraces it so as to exist in and through the many. Being is, in the most profound ontological sense of the term for Latinos, who have experienced existentially multiple crossings, being is communion with others. Divine and human life comes out of the many, e pluribus unum. Divine life is not about sameness, but about oneness. Analogously, Latinidad in the United States, and in fact, the ongoing project of a people we call the United States of America, it's not about sameness, but about understanding the meaning of being one God, one people, one nation under God. In all of these cases, oneness results from affirming cultural differences as being necessary and constitutive of unity, rather than understanding such diversity as consequent upon oneness. In other words, in crossing and encounters with others, the one exists as many. Sacred Scripture and the God who crosses borders. Of course, as Christians, our Latino theological reflections on God's life are not just rooted on our particular human experiences, but also on our distinct readings and interpretations of sacred Scripture. The God of Israel is a God who crosses borders and accompanies a people in liberating and saving ways. The divine name revealed to Moses in Exodus 3:14 is God's assurance that God will cross borders with a people. A presence fulfilled most radically when God crosses onto human life. Jesus lives on the hyphen of human and divine life. And like Latinos, his hybrid humanity was shaped by multiple human experiences and cultures that resulted from crossing many borders. The Word of God, observes Elizondo, quote, cross the border between the eternal and the temporal, between the divine and the human, to become Jesus of Nazareth, end of quote. Jesus Christ comes into being on the border of human and divine life, and borders many human lives. No other gospel affirms this premise perhaps better than the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is the outsider who engages in various border crossings. by crossing to the other side, by encountering others and their otherness, Jesus places himself within the context that enables him to grow in self-awareness. These human encounters with others expand his mission in ways that enable his human identity to be more clearly understood as in terms of his theocentric and Catholic orientation. For the sake of argument, just consider Mark 7:24 through 31. Entire, the Gospel of Mark presents one of the most fascinating stories associated with Jesus' border crossings. In many ways, the story of the Syrophoenician woman, Mark 7:24 through 31, summarizes the theological significance of Jesus' border crossings in the significance of the multiple uses of this phrase in this gospel, crossing to the other side. Through his encounter with this woman, Jesus comes to greater self-awareness of the Catholicity of his mission. He is not just a gift for the house of Israel. The encounter with the Syrophoenician woman represents one of the many encounters, many cultural human encounters, where Jesus crosses geographical and cultural borders and undergoes human transformation. Popular Catholicism, the sacramentality of the border and the God who is for us. Our human experience in sacred scriptures and interpretations of sacred scripture are not the only sources that ground our Latino theologies of God. Catholic tradition, and more specifically the traditioning, as Orlando many times has referred, of our Catholic faith in our popular faith expressions, also provides an undisputable foundation for our theologies of God. The rich religious expressions of Latino communities in the United States witnesses how Latinos sense their participation in God's triune life as they struggle to migrate daily from death unto life, and as they seek, express, and celebrate through ordinary life experiences, lo cotidiano, the life-giving mystery of God. I would argue that the ongoing experiences of Latinos living on the hyphen, the marginalization often associated with this experience, and the sacramentalized expressions that refer to this experience in popular Catholicism keeps the Trinitarian story of the one who crosses and is crossed historically relevant as our story of participation in God's Trinitarian life. In his essay that relates theology and popular religion, Karl Rahner argues that revelation is always and everywhere mediated by the concrete life of its hearers. He goes on to argue that popular religion is closer to that first source of genuine religiosity and real faith that consists in God's universal standing invitation to accept divinization, end of quote. There is little doubt that the popular expressions of our Latino faith communities serve as sacramental words that mediate our hearing and seeing of God's word. Through these expressions, Latino Catholics perceive and receive the invitation to accept and reflect upon their participation in God's life. For instance, in the symbol and sacramental expressions of Our Lady of Guadalupe or Our Lady of La Caridad del Cobre, two very distinct but historically related Latino communities and celebrations, in these celebrations, particular Latino communities hear human words in which God's word can be heard. What is, of course, historically specific about this human word is also what is historically specific about the human word of God. That human word I refer to is the word of the cross, in the words of the crucified of history. Or as some of us would like to say, the words of the Juan Diegos and Juan Morenos of this world, the Amerindian and the African slave protagonists that are associated with the stories of Our Lady of Charity and Our Lady of Guadalupe. Conclusion. God crosses from divine to human life. God experiences the cross in Jesus Christ. God continues to cross for our sake in our salvation and becomes humanly present in our neighbor. God migrates to bridge exiled and marginalized human lives. And God invites concrete, historical, and ethical actions as we journey with others in their life-seeking migrations. In Jesus Christ, God crossed onto and assumed human history. God continues to take up life-threatening and life-giving migrations in order to bestow upon humans the gift of the Spirit, who is Lord and giver of life. God, through Christ and in the power of the Holy Spirit, perpetually exists on the hyphen, migrating and crossing onto the home of another. God opens God's home as if to say to us, mi casa es tu casa, and shares familial and divine life so that we might embrace and practice this hospitality and be called back from exile unto our final home. The movement from God to us, from us to God, and from each of us unto our neighbors, specially and preferentially our oppressed neighbors, is what defines